Cuban art is an exceptionally diverse cultural blend of African, South American, European and North American elements, reflecting the diverse demographic makeup of the island. Cuban artists embraced European modernism, and the early part of the 20th century saw a growth in Cuban vanguardist movements, which were characterized by the mixing of modern artistic genres. Some of the more celebrated 20th century Cuban artists include Amelia Peláez, best known for a series of mural projects, and painter Wifredo Lam, who created a highly personal version of modern primitivism. The Cuban-born painter Federico Beltran Masses was renowned as a colorist whose seductive portrayals of women sometimes made overt references to the tropical settings of his childhood. Better known internationally as the work of photographer Alberto Corda, whose photographs following the early days of the Cuban Revolution included a picture of Che Guevara, which was to become one of the most recognizable images of the 20th century. There is a flourishing street art movement influenced by Latin American artists José Guadalupe Posada and the muralist Diego Rivera. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, some artists felt it was in the best interests to leave Cuba and produce their art, while others stayed behind, either happy or merely content to be creating art in Cuba, which was sponsored by the government. Because it was state-sponsored, an implied censorship occurred, since artists wouldn't want to make art that was against the revolutionary movement, as that was the source of the funding. It was during the 1980s in which art began to reflect true uninfluenced expression. The rebirth of expression in Cuban art was greatly affected by the emergence of a new generation of Cuban, which did not remember the revolution directly. In 1981, Cubans saw the introduction of Volume Uno, a series of one-man exhibitions featuring contemporary Cuban artists. 3 years later, the introduction of the Havana Bienal assisted in the further progression of the liberation of art and free speech therein. Colonial era. Throughout most of its 400 years under Spanish rule, Cuba and specifically Havana functioned as the primary entrepot of Spain's empire in the Americas, with a population of merchants, administrators, and professionals who were interested in supporting the arts. In the 16th century, painters and sculptors began arriving from Europe to decorate Cuban churches and public buildings. By the mid-1700s, native-born artists working in the European tradition were active in Cuba. The first of these to leave a substantial identifiable body of work was José Nicolás de la Escalera. Though mostly absent of originality, his religious scenes, particularly those decorating the cupola and altar of the Church of Santa María del Rosario near Havana, are spectacular, and include the first fine art depictions of black Cuban slaves. Vicente Escobar was a mestizo whose skill as a portraitist made him popular among Cuba's elite. Though having no formal art education himself, he opened what was possibly Cuba's first painting workshop, studio, and later graduated with honors from the Real Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Madrid. His portraiture was firmly in the European classical style, but had a distinctive freshness and energy. A slave revolt culminating in neighboring Haiti's declaration of independence in 1804 proved something of a windfall for Cuba, as refugee plantation owners and the slaves relocated to the underdeveloped, underpopulated eastern portion of the island. However, the success of Toussaint and Dessalines' slave uprising spread intense anxiety throughout the Caribbean, and one response to it was the growth of costumbrismo, realist yet romanticized views of day-to-day life, in Cuban art. A leading early artist in this genre was Spanish-born Victor Patricio de Landiluz, whose paintings depicted plantation life as rough but essentially natural and harmonious. His political cartoons for the magazine El Almendez took a more satirical view of the urbanized Creole aristocracy. Opposed to Cuban independence, Landiluz eventually fell out of favor with the public, but his work remains valued for capturing the atmosphere and attitudes of his time. On January 11, 1818, the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes was established in Havana under the direction of Frenchman Jean-Baptiste Vermeer, the oldest art academy in Latin America. It is the second oldest institution of higher education in Cuba after the University of Havana. Continuing to the present day, it has produced many of Cuba's most important artists. By the later 19th century, landscape painting had become popular, with artists such as Miguel Arias Bardu, Guillermo Collazo, José Abreu Morel, and José Joaquín Tellada creating scenes featuring Cuba's lush natural environment. Despite the benign content of their work, many artists were strong supporters of Cuban independence, and some were forced into exile. In 1898, Spain's 4 centuries of rule over Cuba came to an end when U.S. troops intervened on the side of rebel fighters. Independence, however, proved illusory, with the United States controlling Cuba's foreign policy and much of its economy, while strongman presidents did little to foster freedom and democracy. Artists of the early Republican era continued much as before, painting landscapes and scenes of Cuban life in the traditional European style, some of them showing light touches of Impressionism. Many, such as Antonio Sanchez Arroyo, Armando Menical, Antonio Rodriguez Mori, Domingo Ramos Enriquez, and Leopoldo Romanak, went on to become instructors or administrators at the Academy San Alejandro and other arts institutions. The modernist movements which convulsed European art early in the 20th century initially had little impact on the closed, academic world of contemporary Cuban art. The vanguardist artists. In the late 19th century, landscapes dominated Cuban art and classicism was still the preferred genre. The radical artistic movements that transformed European art in the first decades of the century arrived in Latin America in the 1920s to form part of a vigorous current of artistic, cultural and social innovation. By the late 1920s, the vanguardist artists had rejected the conventions of Cuba's National Art Academy, the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes San Alejandro, in Havana, which most of them had attended. In the formative years, many had lived in Paris, where they studied and absorbed the tenets of Surrealism, Cubism, and modernist primitivism. Modernism burst on the Cuban scene as part of the critical movement of national regeneration that arose in opposition to the dictatorship of Gerardo Machado, American neo-colonial control, and the consequent economic crisis. They returned to Cuba committed to new artistic innovation and keen to embrace the heritage of their island. These artists became increasingly political in their ideology, viewing the rural poor as symbols of national identity in contrast to the ruling elite of post-independence Cuba. The vanguard leader Eduardo Abella, a painter who studied in Paris, was typical of the movement. He discovered his homeland Cuba from abroad, apparently motivated by a combination of distance and nostalgia. On his return, Abella entered a highly productive period of work. His murals of Cuban life were complemented by cartoons which became social critiques of Cuban life under the authoritarian Machado regime. Pioneers of the movement included Abella, Antonio Guiterno, Victor Manuel, Fidelio Ponce de Leon, and Carlos Enriquez Gomez. Born around the turn of the century, these artists grew up amidst the turmoil of constructing a new nation, and reached maturity when when Cubans were engaged in discovering and inventing a national identity. They fully shared in the sense of confidence, renovation, and nationalism that characterized Cuban progressive intellectuals in the second quarter of the 20th century. Antonio Gitano and Eduardo Abela were the earliest painters of the generation to adapt modern European and Mexican art to the interpretation of the Cuban subjects. They also found in the directness and idealization of early Renaissance painting an effective model for their expression of Cuban themes. These painters' Criollo images, for all their differences, shared a modern primitivist view of Cuba as an exotic, timeless, rural land inhabited by simple and sensual, if also sad and melancholic people. Although rooted in Cuba's natural and cultural environment, the vision of Lo Cubano was far removed from contemporary historical reality. Instead, it was based on an ideal conception of patria that had been a component of Cuban nationalism and art since the 19th century. This idealized vision featured strongly in the portraits and landscapes of Victor Manuel, who was particularly impressed by the works of Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin during his two relatively brief stays in Paris. A San Alejandro graduate highly skilled in drawing and composition, Manuel chose to apply primitivist simplicity to his Cuban subjects, a favorite being the female face, and brought out qualities of melancholy and strength, as captured in La Gitana Tropical, which is considered by critics to be one of the defining pieces of Cuban avant-garde art. The emphasis which Carlos Enríquez and Fidelio Ponce placed on the themes of change, transformation, and death have had an enduring impact on Cuban art. Enríquez and Ponce represent two approaches to death, the first marked by exuberant flight and emotion, the second by moody contemplation. If Enríquez painted the delirium after the triumphant siege, Ponce painted the anteroom of grief. Enríquez was a self-taught painter from a wealthy family, while Ponce, though he had attended the San Alejandro Academy, spent his life in poverty. What these two most original and distinctive of the vanguardist painters had in common, aside from severe problems with alcoholism, was the fact that neither had studied in Europe. Early in 1927, solo exhibitions were held for Victor Manuel and Antonio Gitano at Havana's Association of Painters and Sculptors, followed in May by the first exposition of New Art, a group show featuring mostly Cuban modernists, trumpeted by the avant-garde journal Revista d'Avance. These well-received shows were important strides towards the acceptance of modern art in Cuba. The masters of the first generation of Cuban modernism set the stage for the prevalence of certain themes that would govern Cuban art after 1930, and which would have varying degrees of impact on those generations that would later emerge entirely in exile after 1960. Between 1934 and 1940, and still reeling from the overthrow of Machado, Cuba was searching for its cultural identity in its European and African roots. The landscape, flora, fauna, and lore of the island, as well as its peasants, the often neglected foundation of Cuba's soul and economy, emerged in its art. Wifredo Lam, a Cuban of Chinese, Spanish, and African ancestry, had little direct involvement with the Havana vanguard, but was of the same generation and had similar motivations and experiences with his art. After attending the San Alejandro Academy, he initially took the more traditional route of studying in Madrid, and lived and worked in Spain for many years. After serving in the Spanish Civil War, he fled to Paris, where he came under the wing of Pablo Picasso, who kindled Lam's interest in African sculpture. Lam also befriended the surrealist poet-philosopher André Breton, returning to Cuba in 1941 after 2 decades abroad. Lam was enchanted, dismayed, and powerfully inspired by his homeland. He rapidly developed his mature style, which incorporated elements of Cubism, Surrealism, and African art, along with imagery of the Santeria rituals he'd grown up around. In 1943, he painted The Jungle, which is considered to be among the masterpieces of Cuban art. Amelia Peláez was the sole major female artist of the vanguard year. A San Alejandro graduate, she studied and worked for several years in Paris, where, prior to her return to Havana in 1934, she absorbed the influence of Henri Matisse and, especially, the Cubism of Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. During her long career she worked in a variety of media, including paint, pottery, and mosaic, and explored a variety of subjects and themes. But whether creating her abstracted still life paintings or her famed large-scale public murals, her work consistently employed vivid color and elaborate composition, as well as representations of Cuba's tropical flora and Havana's ubiquitous Spanish colonial architectural motifs. For all its colorful energy, however, French critic Francis de Millomanda sensed in her work a closed, completely enigmatic world, haunted by an enigmatic silence. She, Lam, and Enriquez have come to be considered Cuban art's most distinctive and definitive stylists. By 1935, the vanguardia were recognized in Cuba as an important cultural force, and began to gain considerable notice internationally. Major exhibitions of Cuban modern art were held in the United States and throughout Latin America in the late 1930s and 40s. Wrote Albert H. Barr, Jr., organizer of the Cuban Modern Painting exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1944. We may be grateful for the reckless exuberance, gaiety, candor, and love of life which the Cuban painters show perhaps more than the artists of any other school. Modern Cuban art was at last seen in Paris, France, in an exhibition at the Musée National d'Art Moderne in 1951. The artists themselves saw little material benefit from the growth of interest in modern Cuban art. Occasional purchase awards were doled out, as at the first National Salon of Painting and Sculpture in 1935, but there was no consistent system of patronage, and commissions for Cuba's avant-gardists were rare. Most subsisted on low-paying teaching jobs and commercial work. A few, such as Enriquez and Peláez, had means of support via their families, and some, such as Ponce and Manuel, lived in poverty. The only one of them to eventually command high prices for his work while still living was Wifredo Lam. Other notable artists of the original vanguardia were George Arche, Marcelo Pogolotti, Aristides Fernandez, Rafael Blanco, Domingo Ravenet, Alberto Peña, and Lorenzo Romero Erchaga. The Second National Salon of Painting and Sculpture in 1938 brought to the fore a second generation of modern artists which included Cundo Bermudez, Mario Carreño, Rita Longo, Alfredo Lozano, Luis Martinez Pedro, and René Portocarrero. By the late 1940s, the first generation of vanguard artists had dispersed, pursuing their individual careers. Lam went on to great success, living mainly in Paris after 1952. Arche, Fernandez, and Peña died young. Enriquez and Ponce both achieved some international recognition before dying in middle age. Others, such as Gaetano and Pogolotti, left Cuba and took their art in entirely new directions. Still more emigrated after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which left Cuban artists isolated from art developments and markets in the United States and Europe. Several, such as Peláez, Abella, and Manuel, continued to produce work in Cuba. The vanguardist artists received international recognition in 2003 with the Modern Cuban Painting exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, subsequently shown in Paris. Modern Cuban artists continue to do significant work in this tradition, including Juan Ramón Valdez-Gómez and José Angel Toirac Batista. Naive art. According to European and North American art critics, naive art is usually recognized by its childlike freshness and amateurish qualities, such as lack of accurate perspective, little or no modeling, and bold coloration. Artists who work in this style are generally acknowledged as favoring a more primitive or folk style of art. The term naive itself can be problematic, usually meaning an artist is self-taught. It has been used in the past by academic artists or critics as a derogatory term, since naive artists tend to ignore the basic rules of art. In spite of their disregard for academic conventions, naive artists are often quite sophisticated in the personal forms of artistic expression. The colors used in Cuban naive art are especially vivid, with artists using the vibrant hues of the tropical home to present an idealized view of rural life, with spiritual references to Catholicism and Santeria's origins, legends, and other aspects of Afro-Cuban culture, past and present. This naive style of art portrays the typical Cuban worldview of the enjoyment of life despite its hardships. In the 1950s, American tourism in Cuba created great demand for folkloric and picturesque art, leading to increased production of what came to be known as tourist art, most of which was classified as naive. At the time, this art was seen as a backward, barbaric, and crude form of expression that must be swept away, rather than an authentic representation of a living culture. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, educational, cultural, and artistic activities were encouraged, with artists able to attend the nation's free access art schools. Even so, whether due to physical isolation or disinterest in the world of academic painting, there remained a large number of self-taught, ingenious, spontaneous painters. Many of these artists joined together to form the movement of popular artists in the early 1960s. Although this and other cooperative efforts waned over the following decades, the artists themselves continued to paint. Due to Cuban national pride in academic achievement and artistic training, it had been considered demeaning to be called a naive artist in the early years after the revolution. Since naive artists were not generally recognized by the government as professional artists, they were not taken seriously by the arts community at large, and were at times harassed, their art sales being claimed illegal activity by the Cuban government. In the late 20th century, however, this attitude began to change. In 1997, Sandra Levinson, executive director of the Center for Cuban Studies Art Space in New York City, organized Naive Art in Cuba, a first-of-its-kind exhibition at the Metropolitan Arts Center featuring the art of 14 Cuban naive artists, in addition to the 8 members of the Grupo Bayet Artists Collective from Melo, Santiago de Cuba. These artists were discovered during a 1996 trip to Cuba by Levinson, Olga Hirschhorn, and others, who crisscrossed the island searching for examples of this style of art, of which so little had previously been seen in the United States. The unofficial head of Grupo Bayet is Luis Rodriguez Arias, a baker by profession. He is known as El Maestro to differentiate him from his son, artist Luis Rodriguez Ricardo, who calls himself El Estudiante. Both were represented in the Naive Art from Cuba exhibition, which ran from September 11 to October 10, 1997. Luis El Estudiante Rodriguez is among the most prominent Cuban naive painters. He began painting at 18 years of age. He has described his first painting of a girlfriend's home as horrible. After serving in the army and working in construction, he was assigned to farm labor during Cuba's special period. In those years he began to work with sculpture as a way to supplement his income, turning to painting a few years later. Like most naive artists, he finds inspiration for his work in the experiences of his daily life, religious rituals and the events and people of his community. Having grown up in a neighborhood of mostly Haitian families, he is well aware of the struggles. He sometimes describes his work as polemic. In January 1997, El Estudiante held a one-man show in Santiago de Cuba's largest and most prestigious gallery, Oriente, and continues to take part in exhibitions held by Grupo Bayet. In June 2002, his work was described as riotously colorful and stacked like a rush-hour train in a New York Times article entitled "A Brilliant Cubans Make a Lot Out of a Little," which also speaks of the art market success of his naive style. Another artist featured in the 1997 Metropolitan Arts Center Naive Art from Cuba exhibition was Julian Espinosa Rebolledo, also known as Huaycan. Born in 1931, Huaycan began painting as a child, attending school only through the 3rd grade. This self-taught artist supported himself as a builder, auditing courses at the Cuban Academy when he was older. In the 1950s, he joined the Signos Artists Group and participated in his first exhibitions in Japan and Switzerland. Although an admirer of Miro, Chagall, Degas, and Picasso, his greatest inspirations come from observing the practice of the Santeria religion. Many of his paintings show its influence, containing vivid colors and religious imagery, with an almost hallucinogenic quality. The foremost naive artist in Cuba is José Rodríguez Fuster, known as Fuster. In addition to his paintings and drawings, he has over the years transformed the poor suburb of Jamanitas, Havana, into a magical, dreamlike streetscape, drawing on his expertise as a ceramist to create an environment evocative of Antoni Gaudi's famed Park Güell in Barcelona. There is a chess park with giant boards and tables, houses individually decorated with ornate murals and domes, a riot of giant roosters, gauchos, Afro-Cuban religious figures installed by the entrance of many houses, a Fusterized theater, public squares, and a large mural. The primitive outsider art of Corso de Palenzuela, a self-taught painter of Sephardic ancestry, taps a rich lode of memory for its source material, depicted in a very personal Cuban landscape. Although he emigrated to the U.S. with his family at the age of 8, his colorfully vivid work places great emphasis on bringing out the rich cultural heritage of his native land. Although not technically a naive artist, Manuel Mendez is perhaps the single most important exponent of contemporary Afro-Cubanismo in the visual arts. Born in 1944 into a Santeria practicing family, he graduated from the prestigious Academia de Arte Plásticas San Alejandro in Havana in 1962 with honors in sculpture and painting. Few naive artists have been represented in either contemporary art salons of the Biennial of Havana. However, with growing interest in the genre, there are, as of 2015, increasing numbers of academic artists who have begun to paint in this style, with greater representation for all.